Okay, so we're preparing to live stream. And I actually will take that cushion back because it's too high. Right, yeah, we're live. Okay, so now I'll go back to sharing my screen. Okay, guys, so welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum, our virtual events. We are technically back in person sometimes, but it's just been a nightmare organizing, to be honest, the logistics and the technology, because the iPad won't talk to Zoom, which won't talk to Facebook. So there's 5 different things happening at one time, and then one of our speakers couldn't come in person, so it was just easier, and the sound quality, etc., is better. So today we're going to have a kind of just an open forum. Peter and I will, lob back questions at each other and kind of discuss what's been in the news in Ireland for the last number of years about this topic, and then we'll open it to questions and comments from the audience. So we're going to talk about commemoration and remembrance of history, and this is a very important, I think, part of the museum's role for sure. Of course, our mission is to preserve the culture and heritage of Irish people in America, but also to kind of bring us up to date on what's happening at home. And we've been entering a very exciting and complicated, which I think is always good, time in Irish history and politics. The last 10 or 15 years of Irish society have been really transformational in lots of ways. We've had the LGBTQ, the marriage vote, we've had the repeal of the 8th. So Ireland has been coming kind of out of the shadows in lots of ways. We've had 3 different reports into Magdalene homes and church abuse and stuff like that. And so there's really a sea change, I guess, going on at home. And then, of course, one of the biggest things going on is Brexit and the whole question of partition and unity and European membership and Irish sovereignty. So kind of bound up in all of this. And I think even the historians who were sort of in charge of the commemoration, they've been planning this decade of centenaries, as they called it, for a long time. So obviously things started in 2016 with the 100-year anniversary of the 1916 Rising, but it has kind of caught them unaware, I think, at times about sort of what has been controversial, what has gone wrong, how to be inclusive. That's one of the watchwords of the day, is inclusivity and diversity. So we're going to kind of talk about 3 different areas, I suppose. The original commemoration and remembrance of in particular 1916 and the War of Independence, and just how that has evolved. So there was big differences between the 50th anniversary of these things and the 100th. Then we'll kind of talk about where it will get complicated for Ireland, which is, of course, to commemorate our own civil war, but even how to include or remember people who died on the other side of the conflict. And then finally, we'll talk about partition and Brexit and how that is impacting the situation. So very briefly, Peter, because I want to turn it over to you. We were just saying while we were talking before we came on that Ireland actually was quite reluctant in a way to commemorate a lot of its history. We have tons of songs and stories and, that kind of thing, and even sayings, but unless it's really ancient commemorations, like even the 1798 or 1803, Vinegar Hill, we were, for instance, the famine was something that we didn't commemorate for a long time. Eamon de Valera said they were a blight on the workhouses were a blight on the landscape. It's a very small monument, for instance, on, these mass graves that are in almost every big town in Ireland, over 140 of them in the country. No names, put up anywhere. So if can we talk about that, first of all, like as a jumping off point, that what was, do you think, the national attitude to commemoration, particularly of topics that were kind of difficult?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, well, first of all, good to be here, good to be back, good to be talking to real people.
I know.
I was thinking about this today, and I heard something on the radio recently where the 50th anniversary of the Rising seemed kind of cut and clear in the Republic. You still had people alive from the period, so it was still kind of fresh. And the story was kind of clear. It was, we rebelled, it was a long struggle, and we won. So it was kind of simple. But in the subsequent 50 years, things have gotten a lot more complicated. and 100th anniversary, although further from 1916. I know there's nobody alive from that time. It doesn't mean that that passions are not going to run high. So I think one thing about commemoration, which I just want to clarify from the start, is it can be a misnomer. Mm-hmm. It's sometimes interpreted as a celebration,
yeah,
which is partly true for some people, mm-hmm. but it's more like a commemoration is more like remembering, reflecting mm-hmm. on what happened. So to commemorate something doesn't necessarily mean you were the winner. You can commemorate a lost battle, and the Irish have lots of those as well. Mm-hmm. But there's something reflective in it.
Yeah, and that's actually very important when you are trying to possibly, give an honourable mention to or include, the other side, as you say, whether you won or you lost. Like if you're celebrating something, of course, it would be anathema to include, the enemy, quote unquote. But if you're commemorating something, it would kind of seem that you should have both sides mentioned, without praising one over the other. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. There were families who had people on both sides. So, it's always been an awkward inheritance that we've got from our ancestors is some uncles were in the British Army, some were in the IRA, and you kind of have to within yourself balance that.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, you still respect your ancestors and what they did. It's delicate to say the very.
Yeah, and I think that does kind of speak to the lack of commemoration about the famine, sort of in a way that, when you think some of the strongest words in the immediate aftermath of the famine came from Fenians who were in America. And of course, like Ireland wasn't independent, so there wasn't a lot they could do about it. But, even in early independence, I think one of the first famine memorials in the world was in America. It wasn't at home, so it's an interesting choice that the country has made nationally to sort of sometimes conflate celebration with commemoration, but only to do with war, not to do with a human suffering story sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a simple thing too with the general public. No one really wants to have a downer. Nobody wants to have a memory of a horrible incident. People genuinely prefer something happy or something positive. So in that sense, the public interpretation is important.
Yeah, well, and that brings me to talk about this, and we won't maybe dwell too much on this, but I did want to talk to you about, sort of space and, even deciding what is an important thing to preserve and the various things. So this shop here, the Plunkett store, was one of the last, it was where the 1916 Rising was sort of planned out of. Certainly they retreated to this after the GPO. Obviously it's in the middle of a busy thoroughfare, so I don't know the kind of commercial ins and outs of what happened. Like maybe somebody owned the building for years and didn't want to do anything with it or refused to sell it to the government. But when you think of this, is probably a very important site in terms of maintaining it. It would make a great museum. Hint, hint. So there's lots of things you could do with this building, and yet it's not preserved. And then so if we talk about these huge monuments, or sometimes that there's just a little plaque on a building which is very unobtrusive and you can walk past it if you want, so it's not a sort of an in-your-face way of commemorating something. But do you want to talk a little bit about this Moore Street in 1916 and where are we with this?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a great picture. It's it kind of shows how we often neglect our past, and it really depends on who's writing the narrative. As a historian, you're always kind of going on about it's the victor who writes the story. So if your side wins, then your people were heroes. If your side loses, then the other people got unfair advantage, or they cheated or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it's. And I think of the RIC in this example, like they were genuinely Irish-born people who believed in law and order in their country, and they were part of the empire.
Or just needed a job.
Yeah, they're part of the empire. They got their money from the British, and are we to say they're any less Irish than the rest of us? That's where it gets a little bit complicated.
And do you think a site like this should be sort of saved, or you know.
Yeah, I think Moore Street is famous for its outdoor market, so it might be a
Yeah.
tough one to like in terms of it might be in terms of access and just crowd control might
Yeah.
be an issue, but something
I
like
mean, the
this is
buildings themselves looks fairly dilapidated, you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So I think locations like this are clearly important and should be remembered. Um, so this one clearly has fallen into disrepair.
Yeah.
But, there were many dozens of safe houses in Dublin during the War of Independence
Hmm.
that the Irish used, and they could also be, shown as like you could set up like a mock-up of a safe house and
Yeah.
how people would commit an assassination and then run and hide in this house.
Yeah. And
What they,
there are very good walking tours of Dublin, I think, that address, some of those issues. But it's amazing that like a space hasn't really been saved. There was a very interesting April Fool's joke. I don't know if it was last year or the year before that they were going to put, like slot machines and stuff in the GPO, and there was a war on the internet, and people eventually calmed down when they realized it was an April Fool's joke. But I mean, even the GPO is a very, I don't have a picture of it now, but there's the Cuchulainn statue in the window, there's a little plaque. I know now you can take tours, but all my life when I was in Dublin in college, there was you didn't go to the GPO for a dose of history. You went to Kilmainham jail or one of the other sites.
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why that. I mean, Kilmainham is obviously
Yeah.
a very key location. It's where it's where the
Executions. Yeah.
execution happens.
Yeah.
So that's an obvious one. But the GPO has always surprised me why they don't do more.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm guessing it's still a functioning post office, so
Yeah,
maybe
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
that might have something to do with it.
Yeah.
Queuing for your stamps, you don't want to be, distracted by crowds running through
Hmm.
the corridor. But I think this is a good location, Kilmainham.
Yeah. And I think this is very well done. The entire museum, they've kind of preserved the cell of Joseph Plunkett, where he married Grace, and James Connolly's cell. And even, to be honest, I like the kind of barrenness of this yard. I'm glad there aren't wreaths and statues and monuments. I think it's very moving actually to see it. Like, it would probably look like this when they were there, more or less. So their bodies were not buried here. They were shot here. Very little documentation. I think, there's a couple of sketches of one or two of them, and a priest, had been with them. But there's no, like they didn't photograph them before kind of thing or anything like that. And so then they take them here to Arbor Hill. And this was done almost immediately after the executions. They were poured into graves with lime, and that was done specifically because of what had happened to the Donovan Rossa. Peter, if you want to talk to us about that, the fetishizing of a grave.
Yeah, I mean, we see it in other countries too. It's if you create a martyr and there's a location that people can congregate, then they will come.
Yeah.
And they may cause, they may not, but they may also cause problems. And it gives people a focal point to vent their frustrations. And if you're a government, that's not usually what you'd like to see. So yeah, no, this is a good example of how forgetting or eliminating the past is seen as a step towards moving on.
Yeah.
But of course, it doesn't disappear.
No.
It is still there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so then, of course, one of the other ones, Glasnevin, and I meant to take pictures of, Michael Collins's grave, which is so simple. And then, people like Robert Emmet, don't write my epitaph until Ireland is free. So talk maybe a little bit about how designed, are these, or how deliberate, did the early government kind of make particularly this Glasnevin cemetery site as someplace that you could go, later on. So O'Donovan Ross's, at the graveside oration with Pearse, "You have left us our Fenian dead," kind of galvanized everybody for the 1916 Rising, so they must have been conscious of that when they were burying everybody else in here,
Yeah, I mean, if you go to, I was in Glasnevin a few years ago, and it's an incredible location. It's like within a very short distance, you have all these icons of Irish history buried,
Yeah.
in a poignant place. I feel like again, it's kind of whoever writes the history. The new government was in the Free State was obviously pro-treaty. Michael Collins is a fine big,
Yeah.
big grave stone, and others don't have such. But it looks like it's definitely changed over the years. But initially, it was still very raw and very clear that one side won and the other side lost in the Civil War. I'm talking about.
Yeah, the Civil War, and when you think about how often they were coming to the script, there's so many photographs of different, Kitty Kiernan at Collins's, or the I can't even talk. Sorry, the funerals start in 1915 and kind of keep going, with these heroes being laid to rest, and particularly until the Civil War, everyone was on the same side, and then, it must have been kind of traumatic, sort of too, even though this was a sort of a pilgrimage site. But now we're getting into it. This is the Irie Amach, the 1916 Easter Rising sign, and I don't know, Peter, if you know, but basically this, it was a very blurry slide at the start. This one lists in, I think it's chronological order as opposed to alphabetical order, everyone who was killed in 1916, which was 400 and something people. So everyone, it includes the civilians, of which there were more civilians than anybody else, over 200 and something, and it includes the RIC. And this has been defaced like 3 or 4 times in the last, particularly I think in the last 2 years. I don't know actually when it was erected. It must have been erected certainly on time for 2016, and maybe before. But when they did the last one, they kind of chiseled a few names off. They actually damaged Padraig Pearse's name, which is, incredible. And so this was done because people did not approve of, as you said, the RIC soldiers up there. And for sure, in those days, most of the RIC were, Dublin people, Irish citizens. Most of them were Catholic. Some of them spoke Irish. So it's very hard to see how just putting their name on a monument to acknowledge that which they did, they died in the struggle. Technically they were on the wrong side of the struggle, but isn't it amazing that you can't, because it's not a celebration, as you said, it's a commemoration. So I don't think that the government or the historians who were in charge of the centenary celebrations, I don't think they expected this, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you don't know much, if you're not too well versed in it, you think it's been a century. We've moved on. We're a modern country. We can get on. We can get over it. We've had a Good Friday Agreement, so obviously we can actually get on together. But yeah, this is a great example of there are times when we cannot. It's there are people who, and what's interesting here is it's a public expression on a public stone, on a public sign, and people feel they own it, which in a sense they do. And if there's something on it they don't like, they feel they have the right to express that, and partly in a way you've seen here. So it's kind of the flip side of having a public location for expressing the wishes of the people or the desires of the people. Yeah, sometimes it will turn nasty, and people have long-lasting negative memories of certain people. But yeah.
And to be honest, I actually had not given it much thought. I think because, as you said, we sort of grew up in an Ireland where when the 50th anniversary was happening, which was before our time, but we grew up with those monuments, and I certainly grew up in Kerry with, a lot, and you did too, just over the border in County Limerick, with a lot of clearly these men were heroic, they were martyrs, they were murdered for the cause, the language used, and often these things were in Irish or the old Irish, so sometimes you didn't even really know what it said, but he found death for the sake of Ireland, and it was very clear cut, that these people had been martyred for the cause. And so I actually don't think I kind of even questioned that you would put the other side on a monument. I actually think they were right to do it. I think as a historian, it is an actual fact, that there were 400 and something people killed. Why would we not list all of their names? So I don't know what's going to happen. Are they just going to keep cleaning this? Should they take the RIC names off it and put it on a sort of a separate stone and hope it survives? I think it's sort of a sad commentary maybe on our maturity as a nation, particularly in this slightly dangerous time, when we're talking about Brexit and partition, that we can't at least acknowledge, without honouring, but just acknowledge, these people, all of them died in the same fight.
Yeah, and those people who were fighting, they didn't know the future. They didn't know that there
would
be
win. Yeah.
a free state, and they would be on the losing side. They felt, this is my job, this is what I do, this is what I'm fighting for, and we're going to win. So obviously, when you lose, then you're in a difficult situation. I mean, this image here reminds me, it has echoes of Civil War memory in this country.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
The Irish, I mean, let's be honest, we played both sides. There were Irish people on both sides of the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And we have to not celebrate, perhaps, but acknowledge. And I just understand that there were people on each side.
Yeah, well, that's actually a very interesting point, and I did want to kind of, for us to talk very delicately about that, because we do try to avoid politics as such. But, to give the context of those kinds of commemorations, because I think this is important for Irish people and Irish Americans to think about. When like Civil War monuments in this country went up, a lot of the times they went up again, 50 or 60 years after the event. They went up during Jim Crow laws. Particularly, I'm talking now Confederate monuments as opposed to, maybe the Union monuments. And you're right, Irish people did, did die fighting for the Confederacy, but so did slaveholders. And, sometimes you have to kind of question the motive behind the monument. Like, if it's going up in 1927, in the middle of an election maybe, or certainly with Jim Crow laws, like, that was done not to commemorate the glorious dead. That was done to kind of teach present day population a lesson, and to kind of remind people, I think, of the power struggles. And I'm sure, many Irish Americans would probably have no problem living, in the North, would have no problem with the monument that commemorated Irish Confederate soldiers, without thinking it through, sort of thing, that they might object to a Confederate monument in general, but oh yeah, he came and he served his country and he pulled up his bootstraps, and as an immigrant he contributed. So now I don't get the sense that Ireland is kind of doing that, but do you think there's an element of maybe political correctness at home, like to try to be inclusive, or should they have just done the old tried and trusted of, we'll only honor our own dead, or commemorate?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been maybe simpler, but would it have been accurate? And sometimes, it's like, if you have a member of your family who's going through difficulties and you ignore them, then it might get worse. If you not confront them, but if you acknowledge them and help the people through it, then you come out the other side, in theory, in better shape and with a better understanding of your family member. Equally with your own country's history, if you do not know what was going through the mind of the other side, or the people who lost, and you don't know that they even existed, in a sense, there's no monuments to them, then it's a very one-sided, it's a very incomplete view of history. And if anything else, historians are always dedicated to basically finding as many views as possible. There's always a new slant you can put on something. And I think in the case of Ireland, we, like my parents' generation and my generation, grew up in a very kind of Republican, in the Irish sense, tradition. But especially after the Good Friday Agreement and into the 21st century, and also, if I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but if we are realistic, this has to be said, if we are realistic in the South about having a united Ireland, that's a big controversy that didn't really come out until Brexit, but that kind of brought it to the fore. Like, whether we like it or not in the South, we can't have the same commemoration story in 2050, if the country's together, that compared to 1966 kind of thing, So we in the South, who have the Republican heritage, need to acknowledge, at least, is that something we want to do to broaden the definition of being Irish, to the RIC or the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and those are really difficult questions. And I don't think Irish people have fully understood that this united Ireland has always been a dream.
Yeah.
But if it does come true in the next generation, it's not going to be the nationalism that we grew up with. it's
Yeah.
going to be a different animal, and
Yeah.
we have to live with it, or go elsewhere, or just put up with it.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's an important change. And going back to your point, in a sense, that is being PC.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's also, you only have to look at the fights that are taking place back home. PC
Yeah.
doesn't really always work. People do
Yeah.
have arguments, and yeah, it's just so complicated, it's 100 years ago, but it's so present. It's
Yeah.
so in the everyday.
Yeah. And it's almost, as you said, like the stakes are almost higher now. I think, as you said, like it's so interesting to think that most people who were involved are dead, even though we have a big political legacy, because of course the two main parties, or three if you want, main parties are, coming directly out of it, of the movement. Descendants of them are active politicians, in some cases, but actually the stakes are sort of higher, because if we are to be true to our flag, which was designed in the late 1860s, the white in the middle of the flag is to represent rapprochement and peace between the very acknowledged orange, of the Unionists, and the green on our own side. And so, you know, and yet that flag is usually, it's burnt in effigy in the north. So I think you said in one of our earlier talks this year, the flag might not even be acceptable, really, even
Yeah.
though it is purposefully designed to be inclusive.
Because it's taken on a symbolism
Yeah,
for the unionist side, for example, that is unacceptable. And
yeah,
Elizabeth, maybe you can answer this too. Is as a kid, I remember rarely seeing the Irish, even though we lived in the Republic,
yeah,
rarely seeing the Irish tricolour flown in people's yards. Like as you see over here, you see it a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Oh, yeah, very. No,
you
except for football season.
correct, yeah.
You know.
So you would not, and that's interesting for if you're
Yeah,
proud of the country and this is your
yeah,
country flag, why aren't you flying it? Well,
yeah.
from my side, when I was growing up, it was basically an admission that you were overtly pro IRA.
Republican, like, yeah, yeah,
So, and people didn't want
yeah. Well, and Peter, to be honest, I mean, I am almost 1,000% positive that we were actively taught the flag was green, white, and gold.
Yep.
Like I definitely did not grow up calling it orange, and sometimes
Yep.
it was sort of coloured more gold than orange. Like on official buildings it would be, but there was for sure bumper stickers and things. It was almost always gold, not orange, and I think that's an interesting little kind of
I don't remember
dilution.
what they said the gold symbolized, but it might have been the massive wealth of the Irish people in the 20th century. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I remember like relearning about the green, white, and orange. Honestly, like when I was in grad school, because it was Thomas Francis Meagher, who kind of presented the flag at home in Waterford. And so that's an interesting thing to me, that you're for sure, like, we were not flying the flag. Government buildings had it, and maybe one in the big town square or something. But and I have to say, too much flag waving does make me a little bit uncomfortable. Like I don't think I would ever have a flag on my porch, of any country. Like
So
it's
you might have Kerry
because we
flag.
didn't grow up with it. Kerry flag for sure. Yeah, we'll do that for the football. So Crossbarry. So Crossbarry, I'm just looking at it here, and it was just to show an example of the kind of symbology, and everything that goes on. So this, of course, was one of the more successful, I guess, IRA ambushes of the RIC. But so it's in the old Irish, first of all, that the kind of fancy script, this very ornate, Celtic cross, the crossed guns. So there's a weird fetishization of religion symbols sometimes, and then these violent, oh, John McNally says the gold was for the Catholic Church. I suppose it was. The papal thing is probably gold. Like, even that is not making me feel better, to be honest, but it's in keeping with certainly De Valera's, enshrinement of the Catholic Church in the Constitution of 37. Yeah, that's good, John. See, I didn't know that.
Brilliant.
So the this sword, and so what I'm saying is and no mention, of course, of naturally the British dead. They shall be spoken of among their people. The generations shall remember them and call them blessed. And so there was a very, this is deeply kind of patriotic, but also religious. It's just interesting how those earlier monuments, kind of wed a lot of the symbols together, and I suppose by their very nature are kind of not inclusive then, because I mean it is kind of Óglaigh na hÉireann, Soldiers of Ireland. This was the Volunteers, But like to commemorate the violence even is, you don't see that like in a lot of, like look at Flanders Fields and stuff. They're not memorializing the weaponry. It's the fallen, that are. So I think we've made interesting choices, I think, in our public monuments. Peter, if you want to talk it to.
Yeah, and this is a good example. I mean, there's many examples of this in Ireland, and I think it's interesting because you don't necessarily have to be right. You just need to be first. Get your monument up. If your monument is up, then it's right.
Yeah.
So you get your message across early and often, and move on. That's a kind of very simple way of looking at it, but
it's probably true though.
I think the religious thing is interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, there was no overt reference to the Catholic Church in the proclamation, right? It was very much God, but broadly speaking, right?
Yes, yeah. And a lot of the leaders were vaguely, I mean, certainly the socialists, were atheist that were in there. I do think there is something about in the name of God at the very start, but not the preamble that we get in the 37 Constitution, So yeah, that is interesting. Now, I will say, I gave a talk last night for the Cultural Centre in Boston, and I had forgotten how deeply religious a lot of the women were. Like the McSweeney women and Padraig Pearse's mother and stuff, and a lot of them in the treaty debates in particular kind of do, invoke God, and so that was an interesting kind of a, little remembrance there, that, and because one of them specifically said about the men of 1916, and I for sure Connolly wouldn't have been religious, and I think Clark, wasn't. That they died faithful men, and that they, with a prayer on their lips and blah, blah, blah. It was kind of interesting, how she mentioned religion right away, like that the men of 1916 in particular, died with a prayer in their mouth,
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it goes back to the faith of the people, but also you're not going to commemorate people who fought on the wrong side of God. Of course, they all had God on their side. Because they were right, so God was behind them, but they were still fighting over something, but God was on both sides apparently. So it's kind of, you have to bring that in to kind of complete the aura of commemoration and being
And like I should have looked up, so this is another one, Old Ignaherin, the soldiers of Ireland. On this spot, the North Longford column of the IRA defeated British forces, and these would have been pretty small, kind of, I can't remember what this one was in Longford, Corofin or something, I'll have a look, in 1921. A Yea Sair Era, so God Save Ireland, and so now I don't think these were put up very soon after it. Like, I'm sure there was kind of a lot of them put up in the 1950s as opposed to even the 1930s, but some of them probably do date from 10 or so years later, or there would have been a more rudimentary maybe marker, to make sure of the spot. But it's interesting, how they're weaving in again both sides sort of the culture, the sectarian side, or the religious side, but the militaristic, side too. And this is just a very plain,
and
marker.
You don't see as much. You're not going to see monuments of this is where Irish people fought each other.
Yeah.
What you will see is this is where we fought the British and won. It reminds me a little bit in France, their World War I and World War II commemoration is quite different. World War I is very cut and dry. It's like heroes died in Flanders Fields. World War II, you had the collaboration, you had Vichy, you had the openness of that. Any average village in France, they will probably have a monument to the First World War, but they will not, or it'll be very small, to the Second World War, because they're not quite sure. Even they are still 80 years later trying to grapple with what exactly they did during the Second World War. So, it's not just the Irish have this problem.
No. And, this isn't like, look, the flag is clearly gold there, not orange. I don't know if it's sun-bleached. And again, they name the two leaders of the IRA and say 11 of whom, the Black and Tans and RIC, 11 of whom were killed without loss of life to the volunteers. A decisive battle, the Strumkeen ambush in the War of Independence. And I suppose, that was such, in a way, kind of a horrific war, because really none of the battles in and of themselves were incisive, or decisive. It was just the attrition kind of from a propaganda point, really. Because I think Britain, if they had decided we're just going to go for it, and we'll throw everything we have at them, of course they would have defeated, this small force of what, maybe 2,500, 3,000 men, throughout the country fighting, but a dearth of arms, and so you wonder, like, even to say this was a decisive battle, these were just little skirmishes. Like, it was a death of 1,000 cuts for the British, more than any one cut, and then here at the bottom, Ganania, Dia Trocra, or her Gulir, which is actually quite nice, because they have mentioned by name Black and Tans and RIC, and then at the bottom in Irish it says that God may show mercy to all of them. And so they might be including, the other side in the appeal to God. Yeah.
Well, it's true. I mean, what's interesting is the method chosen by the volunteers to fight during the War of Independence wasn't necessarily designed to win. It was designed just not to lose.
Yeah.
And they just had to drag it out as long they're on their home turf, disappear into your village, do your crime and then disappear. And I don't know if the British would have, it's possible, but there would always be some folks who would carry on the battle against them, and it would be a really expensive and bloody. And then at the end of it, you would have turned the country against you anyways.
Yeah. And there's no doubt, I didn't mean to say that they would have won and that would have been it, but I think there was so much going on, like, to operate against the British, like, it was not a military victory, or a military loss, for either side. It was the combination kind of factors. So this one, I just mentioned this one. I can't remember if Upton was the site of. I think there were two different ambushes here, or like they went back the week after. But as far as I remember, it started in a train station. And it was very poor, performance for the IRA, because they lost a lot of soldiers at this one, but 8 dead civilians too, caught in the crossfire, on the train or in the train station. And the monument doesn't mention the civilians. And so, it's Sean of Waylon and Partition O'Talva, I can't really see it, Padraig O'Sullivan, are kind of the leaders, or maybe the three who got out of the station and were shot on the middle of the roadside. But 8 dead civilians to not be commemorated, and it was kind of the same with the 1916 Rising. More civilians than anybody else killed by both sides. It was not that they were all ploughed down by British bullets. They were often caught in the crossfire, and so I think that's and again, the high Celtic cross sort of spirituality, but kind of a lonely little monument too, out in the middle of the countryside. And so there's a lot of these in the Irish countryside.
I guess there wasn't the same glory in dying in the crossfire as there was in actually fighting the British forces.
The British, yeah.
That's interesting.
But isn't it an interesting, kind of choice? Like, did they not die for Ireland?
Yeah. They didn't choose to, but they did in the end.
Yeah. And so then this is Gertha Glana at home between the two of us. You've probably driven past this. So it's actually, the anniversary is this month. It was the other day. And so, this was kind of so I'm showing you this because it's actually quite a plain monument. It's a way in. This is kind of the view from the roadside, and you have to climb in over, to see the monument. 3-4 men stopped to talk, funnily enough, having been to devotionals that were held by Jesuit missionaries in Listowel, and because they were kind of aware that the RIC would be going around the place, because Kilmorna House and Arthur Vickers, had just happened the month earlier, they hid in the field, and they sure enough heard a convoy coming. And the British make a disastrous decision. First of all, they shoot them more or less in cold blood, like beat the sugar out of them. They strip them, they move them, half a mile down the road and bring them back and line them up to shoot them. And one guy just decides, he'll go for it. His executor paused, and the man next to him fell back and was shot, and the other guy ran, and he was shot in the leg but managed to survive. He ran for 3 miles. But the British claimed that 100 men had ambushed them, and that the 3 dead men, were involved in that, and that they didn't get any arms or anything, and there was likely to be more dead, kind of scattered around the countryside. And then eventually, it was forced to go to an inquiry, and the one man who survived it came to America. So this monument, is there's famous songs written about it, and I will say, even though I grew up maybe 6 or 7 miles from it, we've never had like a school trip or anything to, you just kind of go by accident, sort of, if you want to go. But were you ever brought to this monument or anything? I
No,
suppose enough to have you feel like, yeah.
I never went to it. We would have gone to the ones in Cork because my mother was in Cork and we would have driven that Clonakilty. So I know Kilmichael, I know Béal na Blá, but
yeah.
I have not been to this place a few miles from where I grew up. So
I know. Well, see, that's it. Yeah. And actually, that's, you know, we'll move on for this, but that is an interesting kind of comment too, isn't it? That like we both of us have not been there, you know, even though it's very close. So you wonder how often, like, are these actually visited? You know, it is interesting, I think. So now we're into the Civil War here, and I do actually, I have to say, think that this is a beautiful statue. So this is Ballyseedy outside Tralee, and this was very problematic. You know, again, it was Free State soldiers against anti-treaty neighbours. You know, these are all men from the Tralee, kind of maybe Killarney area, that would have fought together in the War of Independence. And you know, the story is they were 7 or 8 men were taken into this field, tied together with barbed wire, and then the Free Staters threw a couple of grenades in amongst them and, you know, kind of blew them to bits. But one guy was blown out of it safely, like he had shrapnel under his skin and stuff and kind of burn marks, but he survived, you know, to tell the tale. And so the statue, which I think was only put up in the 60s or 70s, is allegedly like a mother whose 2 sons, you know, are kind of like, the one guy is turning his back on his brother. The victim might be the, you know, the anti-treaty side. Like, I don't know how biased or not the thing is. And then, of course, this, you know, the danger here is, of course, the kid looking at this fella, you know, maybe for inspiration. And so it's a very interesting, I think, depiction of sorrow and civil war, you know. In terms of art, you know, I think there's a lot going on there. But I have a funny story. I went to see this guy speak in Mistole in about 2002 or 2003. I was teaching history in the boys' school at home, and this man was like 101 at the time. He was living in Castle Island, and he had fought in the War of Independence and in the Civil War, and he was a Devil era guy through and through, you know, like he had, it was actually interesting listening to him, because it was like he had never, you know, read another book. He just remembered things as they happened at the time, and so like no new information had allowed him to kind of rethink, you know, his decisions or factors that he did not know at the time, couldn't have known at the time, you know, had not changed his viewpoint. But he told a story about Ballyseedy, and that he was in a bar, you know, like in the 60s, in the 1960s, one night in Tralee, and a fella walked in and one guy walked out, and he said to the barman, you know, what's that about? And he said, oh, you know, that's an ancient feud, like they were enemies in the Civil War. And the fella that sat at the bar said, I can't remember the name of the family, so I'll just say O'Connor. But he said, Irish, or for God's sake, it was more than the Civil War. The O'Connors had bacon during the famine. So, like, you know, there was, not only was he cross at him for what happened 50 years ago, but he was also cross at the family for what had happened, you know, 50 years before that, you know.
Yeah.
And so, so the Civil War, I think, is going to be problematic, Peter, for Ireland, you know, coming up next year. Like, both, or Sinn Féin too, so Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, you know, have their political roots in the Civil War, as of course does Sinn Féin. So it's very real and present in one way. I mean, you know, we've been very lucky in the country that the gun was taken out of politics, as they say, you know, pretty quickly after the Civil War. But it's going to be problematic, I think, to commemorate this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, hopefully we've learned a few lessons from the past 3 or 4 years of commemoration, but I'm not sure we have.
Yeah.
There's a great, if it's a book or an article written by Diarmaid Ferriter,
Yes, I read it. Yeah.
The title is Scramble for the Bones of the Patriotic Dead, which kind of reminds me of what the political parties are doing. They're trying to take it upon themselves to be the only true
legitimate, like, yeah.
So it's a legitimacy that they're looking for,
yeah.
and they all have a case to make.
Yeah.
And they're pushing it because it's kind of the moment to do it.
Yeah.
But you wonder if they're all saying they're right. If they're all saying they were the original of the species, obviously some were not, and some, you know, obviously someone's fibbing a little bit. So
yeah.
But in a sense, it's just a quest for identity and being tied to a positive story, like a positive.
Actually, I hadn't thought about this, but, you know, what do you think this will do to or for Sinn Féin, for instance? Because I mean, they inherit possibly most legitimately the De Valera or the anti-treaty, kind of mantle. But of course now they recognise the legitimacy of the 26th state county Ireland because they're in the state. So and we're tiptoeing around, of course, partition, and Brexit. So how should they handle this? I've seen the government, and you can all look this up. There's a program of centenary, things that the Irish government released. What I think the government seem to be doing next year is sort of sidestepping. There's a big Manaw 100, for instance. There's a big women exhibition, of women's involvement in the last 100 years. I think I saw not necessarily LGBTQ, but there was focus on geographical areas, and there was focus on sort of anything but the mainstream kind of three parties. So yeah, if you wanted to kind of spitball about what you think Sinn Féin or Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael can do next year.
I think you're right. I think Sinn Féin probably had the most kind of direct phone line to 1916 in a sense. But in the meantime, they've had a lot of baggage that the other parties don't have. So my suspicion with Sinn Féin is that they're doing well, not because people are rabidly Republican in the Republic. It's because their policies are very progressive and very, state aid based, very kind of what traditionally Labour would be. So they've kind of, Labour has shrunk, and those supporters many of them have gone to Sinn Féin, because they're more dynamic and they're more active, and there's a chance they'll actually be in the government. My thought is, though, if Sinn Féin does not get into the next government, they're at a bit of a crossroads, because I feel like they've gone as far as they can in terms of numbers, and they're like, what, second biggest? Or, I mean, they're definitely...
They're kind of tied, aren't they? All three are sort of neck and neck,
So, I mean, the fact, for us growing up, you could never imagine Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil cooperating on selling cupcakes, never mind running the country.
Yeah.
And now you have them in government.
Yeah.
And the one thing that would unite them was, do not let Sinn Féin into government.
Yeah.
Now, that's a negative way to look. That's a negative way to look at it. But I do think if Sinn Féin do not get into government next election, they may face a departure of voters, because they'll be seen as the also-rans. They'll be seen as the party that tried and failed.
Yeah.
But a lot of things can happen.
Right. Yeah. So we'll just quickly look at this, because again, this is the plaque that's at the bottom of Ballyseedy. So it says, oh God, I can't even read that. From this day forth, all who pass this way will know that the men of Kerry who fought and died for Ireland are not forgotten, and oh God, I can't even go down as this memorial stands at Ballyseedy. Unselfish upholders and fearless defenders of the Irish Republic, these 8 men of Kerry, whose names we trace with pride and remember with homage, suffered martyrdom on this spot on the night of March 6th to 7th, 1923. It also commemorates their comrades Dennis Broderick, John Galvin, Mike Ryle, Seamus, who died for Ireland in this locality. So, like that, those are kind of strongly worded, considering it was the Irish state now who killed these men, And so it doesn't say they died for the sake of Ireland. In Irish it says, that God, or at the right hand of the Lord will be their souls. But there's a very... they're kind of are laying claim to a legitimacy of patriotism, sort of, I think, that is very interesting, considering, as I said, it's the state, that killed them, technically. Yeah. So let's now, Peter, just go back to talking the main thing I think that maybe people would be interested in is the whole impact of Brexit and partition, perhaps. So we're commemorating, I was going to say celebrating, we're not celebrating, we're commemorating partition this year, so 1920 or 2020 was the 100th year of the Government of Ireland Act, which made partition a reality. I sometimes argue, to be honest, that partition was a reality as early as 1912, realistically, or certainly 1914, when the Home Rule Bill that passed in 1912 had to be shelved, because by then they knew they would have to make some allowance for Ulster. And then this month is the 100th anniversary of the government, which had been brought to being in the 1920 Act. So the Stormont government opened this month 100 years ago. And of course, the Irish government, which was part of the same act, followed the abstentionist policies of Sinn Féin, so they did not take their seats in the supposed to be new, except for the four unionists. They opened it, they closed it, it was never called again. And the Irish government went on about their business of running the country during the War of Independence. So how will we, and how will the North manage partition? Commemorations.
Commemorations. Yeah, again, if it's complicated in the South, it's even more complex in the North because it's very in your face still.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been 23 years now since Good Friday Agreement. It's not even a generation. I mean, the people who were involved in the conflict are still alive, many of them, and their kids are obviously indoctrinated in their views as well. So it's a very raw and a very live issue. The complexity of Brexit is that it kind of exposes the lack of choice. Like it exposes that there's a dead end in following a Brexit path. Like, first of all, the people in Northern Ireland voted to remain. So the fact that that the Brexit is even happening in the North goes against the democratic will of the people. But we'll put that to the side. UK in general was 52% for Brexit. But if you look at the North, it is, in a sense, it's an ideal opportunity because they're now given the choice, the chance to be in both the European single market and the UK market. It's a kind of a special position. But the unionist side protests that because they want to be only with Britain. Now, for business, for travel, for students, it makes sense to be in both places because you give yourself the most options. And it was this option, it was options that was key to the Good Friday Agreement. You didn't have to choose a British passport. You didn't have to choose an Irish passport. You could have both. And it just diffused the situation to a degree that they could make an agreement. What Brexit has done if the word is refused, it has brought back the choice, the stark choice between are you with us, or are you against us? And that is a very dangerous spot in Northern Ireland. So and it's very technical now. It's like, import duties and checks on the border. It's not high political battles anymore. That part is done. It's very technical and it's very boring and it's very detailed. But even those things have provoked strong reaction in the North. So, it's hard to know. I think commemoration is really hard up there. And if we thought things were getting better with the Good Friday Agreement, and they were, no one has been killing each other, which is always good, but that's a pretty low bar. And what Brexit has done has brought up difference. It has brought up contrast, which in the past 22, 23 years was slowly disappearing. And that's not positive. And I think it's going to be a real problem.
Well, and Peter, every time we've talked about this, which is only twice in the last 6 months, but you did the series for us when I came here first. So we had a whole 6 lecture series on Brexit or certainly modern Anglo-Irish relations. I don't think that we were ever this, pessimistic about it. Even though we knew that, the vote had happened, I don't know, did we think that maybe there would be, I certainly didn't think there would be another referendum, but I thought maybe that it would be less of a hard, kind of Brexit, or it's just been very interesting to me and kind of sad that in the last 6 months, especially, or maybe 8 months, that it's becoming more likely to be a very difficult time for the North. Because I think maybe originally I was just so kind of buoyed up by the fact like that America, even Trump's America, where he doesn't necessarily have any Irish ties, that they were sort of backing up the Good Friday Agreement, not necessarily the Trump administration, but certain politicians did say that. So I think that's what I was focused on, was that, well, the Good Friday Agreement will be upheld, there won't be a border. But now that we're into the nitty gritty of it, and there's so much, it's an emotional word to use, but there's hurt like on a lot of the sides, because I think unionists are almost flabbergasted at how little interest England, actually have in them, and then when you think about, maybe you're like, why don't you all join the Commonwealth, or why don't, like there's all these kind of crazy suggestions being thrown out as well, and so I'm not sure where it's going to go, and there has been a slight little resurgence of violence, up there at times, very contained, but we saw the young unionists recently, not to mind the murder of Lyra Key a year or two ago, so I think I think I agree with you. It's not looking great like for the North at the moment, and I think commemorating partition is just going to throw petrol on the fire, up there. Like, how can they celebrate a government that disenfranchised Catholics very early on,
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it depends. If you look at it in terms of unionist versus nationalist, then yeah, it's like good old. It's like the old days. I was going to say good old days. It wasn't the good old days. It was like the old days. Clearly, nationalists are clear green or orange.
Yeah.
But I don't think, having speaking to people in Northern Ireland, there are a growing number of people who do not associate themselves overtly with either nationalist or unionist sides. And the Unionist Party, the DUP in particular, is getting very hardcore, very pro Brexit, even though it's democratically unpopular among the public. So I think there are elections next year in the North, and that should be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of what people want their future to be. I think you have a reasonable number of unionist tradition people who are not thrilled about the idea of a united Ireland in any way, but they think if that's the price we're paying for continuing peace and cooperation and just existence, maybe we can fudge it. Maybe we can dress it up as a compromise. But that's a long way down. That's a long way down the road. It's definitely very, very polarized still, and it's very close to the surface. So you have to be. And you're
like,
right.
there seems to be no way to leapfrog over Ireland for them to remain a European state. Like, that might be the ideal solution in one way, because to be honest, I don't actually know if, I know most people say they would like a united Ireland, and academically I would like a united Ireland, but who's going to pay for it? How are we going to integrate them?
Yeah, the fact is, like, it's been a dream for so long, but it's been a safe dream.
Yeah, because it was never going to happen.
It's never going to happen. It's like that girl or boy you fancy for a long time, but they're never going to look at you. And then all of a sudden they do, and you kind of go, oh, I don't know if I want. I don't know if I want.
Yeah, maybe I'm not interested.
Yeah, so it's like you were out of reach for so long, and we wanted you, and then you're actually within reach now. I'm not sure if we want you. First of all, it's expensive. Northern Ireland is a black hole in terms of money, and we know about the political situation. That's a powder keg. So you're right. It's like who wants to run that place, which is very unfortunate. I mean, there are many people up there trying their best to make this work, and they're fighting against forces that are just breaking them down. And my
and
hope
then the other side is, how willing to compromise will the South be? Like, should Ireland rejoin the Commonwealth as a kind of a gesture of goodwill that we'll remain in the EU, but we'll also, so that then if Northern Ireland unionists are nervous about something, well, at least we have the Commonwealth in common, and again, that would be a bitter pill for many Irish people to swallow.
Yes, of course, and it's our recent history in the European community has been growth and better and more wealthier country. We don't want to go back to the way things were, and in a sense that would be pandering to another group for something we don't want ourselves. So I think they'll find a way to make it work where there'll be looser checks at the border, and things should flow better. But it's going to take a little bit of time, and Yeah, it's for those who thought Brexit was a few months or a few years, it's going to be a generational thing. It's just a
Yeah,
long, slow
it's a
process,
long haul.
and there are
Yeah,
things that we know about it today that we didn't know 3, 4 years ago
yeah,
in terms of complexity and things it touches.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that makes
You
it
know, I remember we had that panel discussion with Dr. Richard Aldous from Bard as well, and we really did think it, not that it would be seamless, but that because I think too the panic about Brexit was so much like, oh, we won't be able to get diabetes medicine, and we won't be, the tulips will be dying at the border because they want it in the trucks. So it was more commerce was the issue, and food supplies and that kind of stuff. But that kind of didn't come to be either. And I remember Dr. Aldous said, do we really think like France is not going to ship stuff to England, or to Northern Ireland? Like it'll be messy for a couple of days, but like they're not going to not ship the diabetes medicine. And that turned out to not be the issue. In fact, it was more potentially dangerously, it's the massive issue of identity is what's going to be the key.
Yeah, and on each side you have on the EU side you have they are in their DNA is protecting the integrity of the single market.
Yeah,
And any little puncture hole is just a first step in a big tear.
yeah,
And that's their fear. That's why they're so stringent with border checks. Whereas the British are saying, just relax, chill,
yeah,
gentleman's agreement, wink and a nod,
yeah,
it'll be fine. But the Europeans are looking for codes because that's what the Europeans do. They have constitutions and codes, and the
yeah,
British are kind of winging it as they've done for centuries successfully, and they're kind of passing each other in the night. It's just too like the odd couple. It's like
yeah.
they don't think the same way, and
No, no, and they never have.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it can work, but it doesn't always
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm. So we talked, I think, for longer than I intended us to talk.
Oh, right.
But if anyone has any questions or comments, I hope we haven't lost you. The good, they're all there. And anyone on Facebook, if you want to type it in the chat, I'll interpret. But yeah, anyone here on Zoom that has a question or comment? Bob.
I was just wondering, the references made to the American Civil War in particular, and what are your thoughts about the idea of, well, first of all, the American Civil War occurred 90 years after independence.
Yeah.
The Irish Civil War occurred almost immediately after independence. America is a heterogeneous nation, heterogeneous religion, cultures. Ireland, for the most part, is Catholic, but obviously there were parts that are not. And you're basically Irish or Scotch Irish or some British. Does any of that factor into it, making it different? Of course, in America, also the issue gets coded as states' rights by some people and some publishers, but clearly the issue is slavery. And so with that tying into the memorials and the Confederate flag, I mean, we had at one time like 12 or 13 states in this country that had the Confederate battle flag as part of their state flag.
Yeah.
And that's only disappeared in the last 3 or 4 years. And the monuments went up, as you said, Elizabeth, they went up kind of in the early 20th century when there was also a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in America at that point in time. So I'm wondering if just that distance and those other factors that I've mentioned about, the heterogeneous society and the homogeneous society, do you think that has any implication in making the Irish one just different?
Yeah, they're clearly different. I mean, they came from different places, and they're, as you said, quite a different makeup of the population. It's interesting why the Civil War happened so quickly after independence. I guess, yeah, I guess they figured we have our guns out, may as well use them before we put them away. But it was very. I don't know the answer,
Well,
but
the English left America, like.
Yeah, they did. They did, but
and that was technically a civil war too, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like look at the loyalists who leave, and but it was a more clear cut win, I think, in America. Not that because possibly I think the seeds were sown of course they were right then for a civil war to happen, or to continue. But I think the fact that there was a decisive victory over an enemy who left gave them time, whereas we didn't have that.
I mean, one thing the Americans did have, and this is kind of total guesswork on my part, is they had space to be apart from each other.
Yeah, yeah.
They could go into the West and not see the other side for their whole life. Whereas little island with 5 million people, you're going to fall over your neighbor. You're going to meet people you don't like every day. I mean, that's a gross simplification, but I do think there was a pressure valve escape for the new states that did not exist in Ireland. And you could go to a state that suited your, style of life, and you lived happily ever after. So until it came to a point where that was no longer possible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just.
But I do think the ones who were not happy left. Like, it's the only time in American history, that people leave the country. Yeah. So really, thousands of loyalists, leave for Canada and return home to England, and so you don't have, like a large proportion of the country who were left here disgruntled with how it worked out. Whereas at home, it was the war was so down and dirty, this guerrilla warfare, flying columns, living in the countryside, and then you don't even get what you fought for, and it seemed, and I think, there was a kind of a cult of the leader a little bit at home too. I know we have that with Abraham Lincoln here, but, like Collins and De Valera were so, they were satellites, or everybody else was in orbit around them, and so when their words, in the treaty debates, Jeannie Mac, like De Valera, did a great job of stoking everybody up, and so, and the women do, and like it's very. I mean, De Valera threatens immediately, we'll have to wade through the blood of Irishmen. There was no sense of they were coming together. I mean, there was a very short period where, like, we will have an election, we'll all run and we'll keep it nice. But, very quickly afterwards, like, it becomes clear from the political leaders that this is not workable. Like, we cannot accept this treaty. So, the Civil War was nearly inevitable, I think, really at home. Whereas it wasn't inevitable here because England left, or Unionists left.
Well, they left, but of course, then you also have really the Second War for Independence, which is the War of 1812.
Yeah.
You still had British troops that in North America, because they were in Canada, but they also refused to leave the Northwest Territory, which is now the center part of the country. But so you had some of those things too.
Yeah.
But I think that the drive in the American Revolution, and that came about slowly too, because you had people who were still trying to reconcile with the king. You had the firebrands in Massachusetts, but you had people who still thought of themselves as British subjects, and the king wouldn't do that to us, and yet he did. Mm-hmm. And so you have that piece of it. I do think, Peter, when you talked about the West in particular, that is a huge option over time too, because that basically opened up after the Revolution and continues to open up through the late 1800s in the United States, and you kind of went from there.
But Bob, you have a point too when you said, like, look at the Germans, who didn't give a sugar about the King of England, or like Irish immigrants, in the 1700s, who really kind of didn't care. Like, so what if we have to pay duties to him? I'll have to pay duties to someone anyway. I think there was a lot of the population weren't bothered, Yeah, Jack, had you a question or a comment? You're muted. No, you're muted still, but I think you're telling me you didn't. Mm-hmm.
One more thing that strikes me is
we're okay.
Is the distance.
Yeah.
The colonies are, especially in the 18th, 19th century, weeks away from Britain.
Yeah.
And to send troops and whatever you want is expensive and takes a long time. Ireland was in the shadow and still is in the shadow of Britain. So proximity just made it that bit more raw, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's an interesting comparison, but that's what I can think of for now.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing too, because I was just reading this, I was telling Elizabeth the other day, just reading the Chernow's book on Grant, and talking about the trying to get the restitution from the British government for the Confederate raiders that they built and turned over to the Confederacy, particularly the Alabama, which caused significant damage to merchant ships for the United States. And it finally got settled in, I think it was 1871, 70 or 71. But at one point, there's a significant faction of American senators in the Republican Party in particular that wanted British troops out of Canada as part of settling the claims from the Civil War. Now, they didn't get that, and Grant didn't want that because he saw that as unworkable. But that was just another thing that was still in there, and they wound up using that as an opportunity to clean up some of the other border arguments between Canada and the United States from east to west. But I did think it was kind of interesting, and that treaty is being touted, that settlement, as they didn't go to war between Britain and the United States. They submitted it to a tribunal. They worked out a deal that should be the way the world should work in the future. And then that kind of paved the way, according to these historians, that would give the United States an equal footing with Britain as it churned closer to the 20th century because of the massive industrialization that was now going on in America. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's those pieces too. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it just seems to me that wherever Britain went in the world, they screwed it up. They just did. I mean, because they were colonies and they were treating people.
Well, colonization.
Yeah, I mean, it was colonization.
Yeah, but I think, to be honest, civil war follows almost every war of independence, because there is a pushback against a colonizer or whoever it is. So, Ireland's situation was not unique as such. It's just very immediate. Jack, did you have a question?
No, I'm okay, thanks.
Oh, yeah. And Jean, are you good, or have you a comment or question?
Yeah, I particularly really enjoy this evening, with in the references to our own Civil War, and what Bob was saying about, and Peter was saying about the space and the movement. And we know that the Union soldiers and sometimes some of the Confederate soldiers were working out west, committing genocide against the Indians after the Civil War. So I'm just thinking there is this population, and Peter referred to it, that, if you've got your guns, let's use them. So there's that kind of mentality that's there. And the overriding question always is, how do we get along with each other?
Yeah.
How do we keep our own personal identity and still honor other people? It's, we're still struggling with that, certainly in our country. And, I hear you, and also what's going on with Northern Ireland. It's just a central issue of being a human being. I'm not posing any answer.
No, I think you're right. I think, to my mind, what works best in terms of solving, in terms of controlling these issues, is get to know somebody on the other side, mm-hmm. who you share an interest, whatever it might be. Could be sport, could be whatever. And they will humanize your other. They, like, meeting a Protestant from Northern Ireland initially might be a bit shocking, would have been shocking me. But now I know many of them, and they have everyday problems like we do. So they're not aliens, but each side portrays them as such. And until, this is the whole point of the peace process, is get people playing sports. Like there's a program up there which puts Gaelic footballers, so a kind of a national sport, with rugby players, and they go to different clubs around Northern Ireland and they just kick a ball. They have fun. And they realize that it doesn't matter if you're Protestant or Catholic. You can just have fun kicking a ball and throwing it and whatever. And if I want to just maybe finish on one positive note, because I feel there's a lot of negative. Sport in Ireland is huge, and we have our Gaelic games. One thing that our sport can do is divide. So the sport of soccer has two separate teams, Republic and Northern Ireland, and traditionally they hate each other. That's how it's always been. One sport that bridges this divide for various reasons is rugby. Mm-hmm. The rugby team that wears the green jersey of Ireland is from all over the island of Ireland, and that's rare. And I've heard interviews with nationalist and unionist rugby players, and it's this fraternizing on the field and trusting your buddy, you know, in practice, like almost like an army, that you get to break down the barriers and get to respect them for who they are. You mightn't agree with where they come from, but there are things you like about them and you're not going to fight them. So it's very simplified, but I think sport is a huge barrier breaker personally. And I think rugby is a good example of it can work. Mm-hmm. It's not impossible. Mm-hmm. And, you know, hopefully that's a positive sign.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, we saw it with the rugby in terms of the anthems and stuff and the song, you know, there has to be compromise really on both sides, you know, and so like that's kind of the danger of this commemoration, I think. And when I was trying to formulate what I wanted this talk to be about, you know, I was thinking about even here in Albany, you know, like there's been calls to tear down the Philip Schuyler statue because it was put up in the 1970s, I think. You know, he owned slaves. He may have already, you know, have been a founding member of the Manumission Society. So it's difficult, like, you know, memorials to who? Like, who decides to put them up? What space they're in? Is someone worthy of being commemorated forever? Like, if we find out new information, you know, and so and I think Ireland, we're so young and new in that process that I think it's very difficult, you know, for the nation, and it has very real consequences now that we are in partition and Brexit and all of that, that maybe the stakes are kind of very high to get this right, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I think we started the talk by saying that about, you know, trying to be inclusive without just paying lip service to it, or without performing, you know, an inclusive kind of thing. So, you know, we'll have to revisit this topic. I think it's one of the longest talks we've ever given, really, with only 14 slides. I want to thank Dr. Peter Maloney. He's from County Limerick, but that's okay. We won't hold it against him. He's practically a neighbour of mine at home. We share the River Feel. And I want to thank our audience on Facebook and on Zoom for tuning in. We are back on June 2nd with... oh God, Padraig, I forget his last name. He's coming to give a lecture. It'll be on Zoom about an Irish language kind of historian and scholar in the Anthracite region of Pennsylvania. So that might be on our Facebook page already. And I'm doing the newsletter. It'll be out this week. And we've loads of other talks. Ambassador Mulhall, the Irish ambassador to America, is speaking with us later on in the month. We have a book about John F. Kennedy in America. 2 Irish writers are going to speak about that. So we've a varied program of events. Oh, and something about the Adirondacks. So a very varied program in June. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Maloney. Peter, as I said, I'm delighted to have you back on. You've been one of our stalwarts since I came. So we'll see you again. And did I say Maloney or Murphy? I did say Maloney, did I?
You say Maloney, yes.
Oh yeah, good. Phew, I was like, did I just say Peter Murphy? Yeah. So thank you guys, and best of luck to everyone. And I hope I hope that Ireland will come out of this okay. And good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Terrific.
Yes.